O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. All right, so tonight we are skipping a little piece of the book of Numbers again, because as I always say, right, we're going through the life of Moses, so when we get to sections of material that aren't sort of narrative and or don't involve Moses, we're sort of passing over those. And you could find me talking about everything chapter by chapter, verse by verse elsewhere. But here we're focused on sort of the lives of men in the Bible. Right now we're doing Moses. So we're going to be picking up tonight in Numbers chapter 16. The last couple of Bible studies we've been talking about. So there was the initial, we followed Israel on the initial journey out of Egypt and then to Mount Sinai. Moses experienced top Mount Sinai, which he's given the Torah, which is given to the people of Israel. And then from there, right, they left Sinai and they went by a particular route directly to the sort of outskirts of Canaan, where the place where God had promised to give them land. And when they arrived there, what we've been talking about the last couple Bible studies is that they sent out what are usually called spies. And they were sort of spies in that they were checking out the military defenses and that kind of thing of the Canaanite cities, but they were also sort of surveyors who were hold on just a second. So Michael, you could edit that out later, or we could leave it as an Easter egg for the real old head fans of my Bible studies who remember the bread refrigerator beeping. I'd have to go turn it off. But anyway, the 12 people, one from each tribe, who were sort of designated to go and investigate the land. They're usually called spies. As we said, that's appropriate because they're looking at the military defenses and military power of the cities of Canaan. But they're also sort of surveyors because they're also looking at the quality of the land for farming, the wild growth of certain food-bearing plants and trees, et cetera, et cetera. And when they came back, as we talked about, they sort of universally gave a good report in terms of the quality of the land. They also universally gave the report that the military defenses and the military might of the Canaanite cities was immense, and that it included there being Nephilim or giants there. We've talked about the giant clans before. We'll talk about them again. We won't go into that right now in our recap, but in general, that the resistance they could expect in a kind of invasion situation was definitely formidable. The place where the reports were not unanimous were that 10 of those sent to check out the land said, no, the military resistance is too significant. This is a bad idea. We need to not do this. And not only said this to Moses, but spread this among the people, so that the people as a whole, hearing this, started to become afraid, started to again grumble against Moses, talk about getting rid of him and going back to Egypt, etc. 2 of the people sent in, Joshua and Caleb, who we talked about, agreed about the formidable resistance, but said, hey, folks, not only to Moses, but also again to the people to try to counteract this, God brought us here. You saw what God did to Egypt. God has promised he's going to give us the land. And so we need to trust God. And with God on our side, we can do this. Nevertheless, it was the sort of fear and sentiments of the other 10 that prevailed among the people. And there ended up being a consequence for this that we talked about last time, where a large number of the people, again, were not only not trusting God and were in fear about this, but we're talking about actively rebelling against Moses and this sort of thing. And God effectively said, okay, this isn't the first time this has happened. You know, the first time this happened, I showed mercy. The second time this happened, I showed mercy. Right, on and on. He said, now there's going to be a consequence. And he said, and that is that other than those two, Joshua and Caleb, the rest of you who are adults now, so that the adult generation at the time, he said, you are not going to get to go into the land, but your children will. Okay, so he doesn't sort of do away with Israel. He doesn't let them die. But he says he's not going to bring them into the land for 40 years. And in that 40 years, everybody who was an adult at that time will have died off. And the children will become adults. And so they will be the ones, the children and the children's children will receive the land. And so that is the sort of consequence that God outlined. And we saw that once Moses, delivered that to the people, then all of a sudden the people were like, oh, no, we could do it with God's help. We could do it with God's help, and tried to launch a kind of early invasion on their own and got wiped out. And so now, as we're kind of picking up this time, the people have sort of settled into one reality, and that reality is that those of them who are adults are going to spend the rest of their life in the camp in the wilderness, right? Although, again, as we pointed out last time, in the camp in the wilderness, fed by God, provided for by God, taken care of by God, blessed by God, but not able to receive that promise of entering into the land. But as we go into tonight, as you might imagine, finding this out doesn't suddenly cure the Israelites of their tendency toward grumbling and rebellion, and doesn't sort of resolve all the issues between different groups and different families in the camp. And so we're going to see them continue to be themselves as we pick up here. So Numbers chapter 16, verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, spoke. Okay, so we have this little coalition, this little faction that is formed. Okay, and some of these, so Korah, he and his family are from the tribe of Levi. Dathan and Abiram are the sons of Elish, and On is the son of Peleth, and they're from the tribe of Reuben. Okay, so one family of Levites, and then a couple of clans representing clans from the tribe of Reuben get together, and they speak. They rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 men of the children of Israel, rulers of the congregation, chosen members of the council, and men of note. Okay, so these families are sort of these three guys from these three families, heads of these three families, are sort of the instigators, but they get together a group of 250 of the people. So they have some ideas we're about to hear. They get 250 people, this chunk of the people in the camp, to co-sign And those 250 people are not just randos. Those 250 people include, right, elders of the people from different clans, sort of significant people in significant families. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "Let it be understood by you that all the congregation are holy ones, and the Lord is in them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the congregation of the Lord?" Okay. So they come to Moses and Aaron and say, "Hey, isn't all of Israel holy? Aren't we all holy? The Lord is living in the midst of all of us. We are all in this holy place. We're all this holy people." Right. So what's up with you, Moses and Aaron, acting like you're better than the rest of us and you're in charge of the rest of us? Right. Where do you get off making yourselves the bosses, essentially? Right. Um, so what do we see here? It's very easy to draw a lot of modern connections, right? Um, you could draw those connections religiously, right? There are certainly some folks we can think of who have a problem with, for example, the idea of priesthood or the idea of bishops, the idea of hierarchy in the church and in religion. Um, and there are certainly, we could read it politically, there's certainly a sort of spirit of democracy here, right? You're no better than the rest of us. Why can't we govern ourselves? Um, so there's a little bit of populist democracy going on here. There's obviously a lot of, we can look at this psychologically, there's a lot of jealousy going on here. But what is going to make this rebellion really a problem? Right? Because as we're going to see, God is going to get involved and he's going to treat this as very severe. This isn't just a question of, for example, Korah and his family, who are Levites, being like, how come his family gets to be the high priest? How come I don't get to be the high priest? There's certainly an element of that, right? And the sons of Reuben, remember, Reuben was the firstborn son. Reuben was the firstborn son of Jacob, of Israel. Now, if you've read Genesis, you know why Reuben did not end up inheriting the firstborn status from his father, because he had sexual relations with one of his father's concubines, basically one of his father's wives. And for committing that sin, he was regulated. But these descendants of Reuben are saying, "Hey, you know, we're firstborn. Why aren't we in charge?" Right? Moses and Aaron are Levites. That's the third son. Where do they get off being in charge? So there's certainly an element of that, right? And you can see how, right, they in their mind they could have an argument there, right? They could have a certain sort of argument of, hey, we ought to be in charge, or hey, or at least, right, this should be democratized somehow, right? This authority should be spread out a little more. You shouldn't just be dictating to us, right? But what's left out of any of those arguments or any of those understandings, of course, is God. What's left out is the idea that, number one, God has put them in charge, that God has given the position of high priest to Aaron, that God has made Moses the prophet and put him in this leadership role, right? And that the reason why Moses is basically just dictating to the people is that he's speaking God's words to them, right? That this isn't just Moses always gets to have things his way and tell everybody what to do, but that he's speaking for God, that's the role as prophet that God has put him in. That's all missing here, right? You notice they say, right, why do you exalt yourselves? Why do you exalt yourselves? So there's an accusation there that Moses and Aaron have put themselves in this position rather than God doing it. And so when we see here shortly the response by God to what's going on, we have to understand here this isn't just a question of who should be the boss. This is a question of who really has authority, and the authority they're really denying is God's. They're really denying God's authority to choose their leaders. They're denying God's authority to tell them what they should do and how they should live. They want rather to decide that for themselves, or to at least have some input. Right. And well, we'll continue. So they this is what they have gathered all these people together to support them. So this isn't just a question of some kind of intrapersonal dispute between Moses and Korah or fight. They've gathered a bunch of people together, presumably because they intend with this large mass of people to do something about it. Verse 4, so when Moses heard this, he fell on his face. And he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, God examines and knows those who are his, and who are his holy ones, and he brings them to himself. And those he chooses for himself, he brings to himself. Okay. Now, where it says, who are his holy ones, it's the same word that gets translated in the New Testament as saints. Right. So what is Moses saying here to Korah? Right. So first of all, he falls on his face, meaning he's being accused of pride. He's being accused of seizing power for himself and placing himself over other people. Right. So he says no, and he bows down in front of Korah. But what he says to Korah is effectively, I didn't take this for myself. God chose me for this. And we've been following the life of Moses. We know very much this is true. Moses not only was minding his own business herding sheep when God called him to do this, but he resisted and argued and just did everything he could to try to get out of it with God, right? To the point that God got angry with him. So this is certainly not something Moses actually took upon himself. Quite the opposite. Right. Now, is he here saying that, like, you could read this another way? You could read this, is he saying to Korah, well, God calls me because God knows me and he knows I'm better than you, right? No, that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. Because he believes Korah and these other men, right, and crowd with them, God has called all of them to certain things because he knows them, right? We talked about this when we were talking about the building of the tabernacle, right? There were these men who are listed as holy men who received the Holy Spirit to do their jobs the same way that a prophet or a priest or a king receives the Holy Spirit to do his job. They received the Holy Spirit to do their jobs, and they're craftsmen. They were working with wood and metal and fabric and textiles, right? And we talked at the time that, this is telling us there isn't one of these that's sort of quote unquote more important than the other or better than the other, right? But that individual people have individual callings to these different things, and God empowers them, and they come close to God and find their salvation by doing it, right? And so what Moses says here is consistent to that. Okay? Now Moses is going to continue. Do this. Take censers, Korah and all his company, put fire and incense in them before the Lord tomorrow. And it shall be that the man the Lord chooses, this is the Holy One. And let this be sufficient for you, O sons of Levi. Okay. So he says, okay. He's talking now to Korah because he says sons of Levi. So Korah and his family, you guys are Levites. you're not good with trusting it was God's decision that Aaron is the high priest. Okay. So Aaron and his family will come here tomorrow. You and your family will come here tomorrow, right? You'll all get censers to offer incense to God, and God will decide whether Korah and his sons are going to be priests or not, right? Because as he just said, this is up to God. It's not up to Moses. It's not up to Aaron. It's up to God. So if God wants Korah and his sons, God is calling Korah and his sons to be priests, we'll find out, right? We'll find out, and we'll do this publicly, right? Then Moses said to Korah, "Hear me, you sons of Levi. Is this a small thing to you that the God of Israel separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to serve the liturgies of the Lord's tabernacle, and to stand before the congregation to serve them? And that he brought you near, you and all your brethren, the sons of Levi, with you? Are you seeking the priesthood also?" So again, Moses continues, he's a Levite too, right? And he says to them, listen, when he says God has brought them near, this is both literal and symbolic, right? There's part of Numbers that we didn't read through in detail. I know you'll all be disappointed when I summarize it here, but that described the way in which the Israelite camp was set up and how they would make camp and how they would break camp. Okay. And the camp was set up in sort of a spiral, so that when they picked up tents, including the tabernacle and everything, they would spiral out and then spiral in to make camp. And so the Ark of the Covenant and the other things in the tabernacle itself, the people who carried that were in the front. And so they would come into camp, they would set up camp and set up the tabernacle, and the Levites, while they were from, would camp there right around the tabernacle, right next to the tabernacle. And then spiraling out, the rest of the Israelites would camp then around them further away. So the Levites were literally, as a tribe, brought near to God. But then also, they're near to God in the sense that the Levites are serving God in all of these ways. Right? The people who carry the Ark of the Covenant, the people who carry and care for all the vessels of the tabernacle, who set them up and take them down and bring them from place to place, the people who carry the curtains of the tabernacle, roll them up, take them from place to place. And then when it is set up and when they've made camp, the people who are in there serving the people, bringing their sacrifices into the tabernacle, doing any number of other things. The comparison that's typically made in the church fathers is to compare the Levites to deacons, right? In that, and that's because deacons in our parishes sort of similarly have this broad range of tasks, right, that they perform, doing all kinds of things to assist in ministry, sort of all over the place. The one thing that they don't have is that they don't offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist. And that's the same thing Moses is saying to the Levites here, right? God has given you all these special tasks, these holy tasks, these holy things. He's called you as a tribe to himself, right? You're supported by the offerings of the tabernacle. You each have these important roles that you're playing in the, as it says here, as it's translated here, in the liturgies, right, within the tabernacle. You have all these things. Aren't you grateful for those? Aren't you thankful for those? These folks here from the tribe of Reuben don't get to do that. They don't do that, right? Nobody from the tribe of Judah gets to do that. Nobody from the, right? And keep in mind, as Moses is saying this, Moses himself is a Levite who doesn't have the priesthood. Meaning, while Moses has gotten to speak to God face to face the way a man speaks to his friend, he doesn't get to go and offer the sacrifices. He doesn't get to go into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. That's the high priest. Right? So Moses is in the same position, really, as these other Levites, right? He's not the high priest. He's not even a priest, right? But he's a Levite. So this is what he's trying to say to them, right? You especially, right? He kind of understands, implied here, he kind of understands the people with them from the tribe of Reuben, right? Who don't have this kind of role. There's these Levites who have this special role, they don't have it. But the Levites here, they especially, he sort of doesn't understand, because he says, you have all of it. Like, you're just missing this one thing that's been given to this one family, but you've got all of it. Why aren't you grateful for that? Why aren't you happy for that, for the ministry that you do have, that God has given you? Why are you just concerned about the one that he hasn't given you? Verse 11, thus you and all your company brought together are against God. Furthermore, who is Aaron that you murmur against him? So he points out two things. Number one, what we already pointed out, right? You may have all come here because you don't like me and you don't like Aaron, right? You don't like us, or you're jealous of us, or you think we're bums, or whatever, right? And you want this position. That's why you think you came here. But he's saying the reality is you're here opposing God, because God is the one who gave us the roles that we have. God is also the one who gave you the role that you have, that you're not grateful and thankful for. You're really here opposing God. And then finally he throws in, like, what did Aaron ever do to you? Right? Like, Moses sort of like, I can understand you being mad at me, because Moses has had to say some hard things, right? Like where we left off last time. Moses had to come and tell them, yeah, you're all going to die in the desert, right? You're not going to get to enter the promised land. Okay, he can understand them being mad at him because of that. Moses has had to be sort of tough with them at various points, right? As much as he loves them, he's also been very hard with them. The whole golden calf episode. There are times where he's had to sort of lay down the law, pun intended. So he gets what I, but he's saying, what did Aaron ever do to you? Why are you upset at him? Like, what's going on there? Verse 12, then Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab. But they said, we will not come up. Is this a small thing that you brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the desert and set yourself over us as a ruler? Even if you should bring us into a land flowing with milk and honey and give us an inheritance of field and vineyards, you would put out the eyes of these men. We will not come up. So he's talking there to Korah and the Levites. Now he tries to talk to the other folks, right? He tries to talk to these Reubenites. He says, why don't you come forward? Let me talk to you. And they're like, no. Right. And implied there is you put out the eyes of these men, meaning, right, the crowd is basically saying no, because you're gonna punish them. You're gonna do something horrible to them for opposing you if they come up to try to talk to you. Right. You're gonna because, and notice again what they say. Notice again what they say. Moses brought them out of Egypt. Moses brought them out into the desert. Right. Not God, Moses. Notice also how they described Egypt, where they were slaves. Egypt is now a land flowing with milk and honey. Not that they got to drink any of that milk or eat any of that honey, right? But Egypt was a land flowing with milk and honey. They're parroting the language that God used to describe the land he was bringing them to. And they're saying Egypt was that. So Egypt was that. And so that's why they say, even if now you were to bring us to a land flowing with milk and honey, net loss, you just did this as a power trip to put yourself in authority, and you'd harm these men. Right. So this is not just, again, an issue of insulting Moses, saying, Moses, you're on a power trip, you're violent, you're going to do all this. You're right. This is an issue of, again, denying what God has done. Literally just straight out denying that God was involved in any of this. They don't mention God once. Right? They don't mention God once. Don't mention Yahweh once. Okay. So they are looking at this purely in terms of sort of physical, temporal, secular, whatever word we want to use, power. This is just about power relationships, power dynamics, who has it over other people, how they're going to exercise it, right? And the fact that they assume that Moses would put out the eyes of anyone who opposed his authority kind of tells you what they would be like if they did have power, right? Tells us how they think power works. Power works through violence, which sounds a lot like Pharaoh, right? Because how did Pharaoh exercise his power? Murdering children, breaking the backs of slaves, right? So they call Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey. Apparently they think the problem with Egypt wasn't anything about Egypt other than the fact that they weren't the ones in charge. Right? They weren't the ones that had power. So it's hard not to see Reflections, as anachronistic as it is. It's hard not to see a connection between these folks and the secular revolutionaries of the modern era. Right. It's very hard not to see connections there. Not that these people, of course, would have been atheists, but like the Egyptians, they probably saw the divine as something to be placated and manipulated, not as one God, their creator, to be obeyed. Right. Verse 15, then Moses was very heavy of spirit and said to the Lord, may you pay no attention to their sacrifice. I have not taken a desirable object from any of them, nor have I harmed any of them. Okay. So Moses has set up the sacrifice he's talking about is the incense they're going to offer the next day. So offering incense is a form of sacrifice. So Moses says, Lord, please don't accept their sacrifice, right? And says to God, and God, of course, would know, right, that Moses hasn't taken anything from them. He has the authority that God gave him. Moses hasn't misused. He hasn't used it to make himself rich. He hasn't used it to punish other people who he sees as his enemies. He hasn't used it to harm the Israelites, right? He has tried to use that authority well, literally as God is his witness, right? And so he prays that God will, when they do this offering of incense the next day, that God will make that clear to the people, right? But notice here, he doesn't want revenge. Spoilers, horrible things are going to happen to these people, but Moses isn't asking for horrible things to happen to these people. Right? All Moses asks God for here is that God would publicly sort of vindicate his name. That God would publicly make it clear to people the truth about who he is and how he has exercised his authority from God. That's all he asks for. Then Moses said to Korah, sanctify your company and be ready tomorrow before the Lord, you and they, as well as Aaron. Let each take his censer, put incense in it, and bring his censer before the Lord. 250 censers, both you and Aaron, each with his censer. Okay. So censers were fairly similar, not identical, obviously, but fairly similar to the censers you'd see in an Orthodox church today. And they were used for transporting incense. So when incense was offered to God in the morning and evening in the tabernacle, it was on the altar of incense. So there's an altar of incense there with 4 horns, points at the corners. It's roughly square, concave in the middle. Right. And so you could keep a fire burning with various things in there. You could throw incense into it, right, in order to offer that incense at the appointed times. Okay. There are also times when you're going to take that and transport it, right, to bring the incense and specifically the smoke to other places. And so then fire would be taken from the altar of incense and put into the censer along with incense, and then it could be taken to different places. Okay, so the idea is that all 250 of these people, right, all these people have their own censers. They are all making an incense offering to God, right? They aren't allowed to all go into the tabernacle, right? So that's why we're using censers, right? But offering them to God with the idea that God will, Moses is expecting, hoping, anticipating that the incense offered by, notice not by himself, but the incense offered by Aaron and his sons and his family, that incense will be accepted as a sacrifice by God, and the incense of the others will be rejected. And this will then make it clear that Aaron and his sons are to be the high priest and the priests, right, from among the Levites, and then issue resolved, right? That's his expectation. So every man took his censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and stood at the doors of the tabernacle of testimony with Moses and Aaron. So they stand at the entrance to the courtyard. Thus Korah gathered all his company against them at the door of the tabernacle of testimony. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Okay, so we've seen this before. Remember when the tabernacle was first consecrated, the people were all gathered at the entryway, at the gates to the courtyard. The glory of God appeared there, right, in front of everyone, at the consecration of the tabernacle. So now this has happened again. Verse 20, the Lord then spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Separate yourselves from among this congregation, and I will utterly destroy them at once. Okay. So this is more than they're expecting. God says, take a few steps back. I'm going to wipe these disobedient people out. Right. They're done for their rebellion. Then they fell on their faces, this being Moses and Aaron, and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, if one man sinned, will the Lord's anger be on all the congregation? Now, this is again fascinating, right? Because still, Moses and Aaron don't want to see all these people die. Right? It would be very easy for a lesser person, frankly, a person like me, right, who is having to deal with this for the 18th time. And by this, I mean people not only rebelling against you, but plotting to kill you. To when God says, okay, I'm going to wipe them all out, to just be like, thank you. Right? Like, take a few steps back so you don't get hit by the blowback. Right? But that's not who Moses and Aaron are. Moses and Aaron say, hey, whoa. right? And they say, okay, well, like maybe the leaders sinned, right? Maybe the Korah, right? The guys who started all this, who sort of roused the rabble, right, and gather all these people together. They said, but you don't have to, right? Like the rest of these people, they're ignorant. They don't know what they're right. They don't need to die, right? Don't please, right? Don't do that. They're interceding for these people who hate them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the congregation, saying, withdraw from around Korah's company. Okay. So God says, okay, Moses, tell the people to stand back from Korah and his company, meaning the leaders. Right. So God says, you need to stand back from these guys who are the leaders of this. So anyone who doesn't, right, they now all have another opportunity. They now all get this extra opportunity that Moses and Aaron interceded for to say, we're with Korah, or hey, you know what? We're not with Korah. This has gone too far. We're not with him. Okay. God gives another chance. Are you sure this is the road you want to go down? Are you sure you want to throw your lot in with this guy? Okay. Moses then rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel went together with him. Okay, so he goes to the leaders other than Korah. He brings all of the elders. So it's not just Moses. He brings all the elders of the people who aren't part of this group with him. Then he spoke to the congregation, saying, get away from the tents of these callous men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest you perish together with them in all their sin. Okay. So he says, look, sin is taking control of them. They're going to perish. If you don't want to be part of this, move away, get away, separate yourselves. So they got away from around Korah's tent, and Dathan and Abiram went and stood at the doors of their tents with their wives, their children, and their little ones. Then Moses said, by this you shall know the Lord sent me to do all these works, and they are not from myself. If these men should die naturally like all men, or if they are visited by the common visitation of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But the Lord will show by a sign from heaven that opening its mouth, the earth shall swallow them down with their houses, their tents, and everything belonging to them, and they shall go down alive into Hades. Then you shall know these men provoke the Lord. Okay. So even Dathan and Abiram, when the chips are down, bail on Korah. Right. And say, yeah, no. Right. So even they take this last opportunity. But Moses says, look, based on what God has told him, notice Moses hones in on exactly what the issue is here. Right. The issue is, did God put Moses in this position of authority and Aaron in his position of authority, or did they just take it for themselves? Right. He says, if I just took this for myself, right, Aaron just took this for himself, then we've no power to do anything. These men, they'll grow old, right? They'll die a natural death the way everyone does, or they'll get sick at some point and die. But I love it. It says, if God sent us, then the ground is going to open up and not only swallow them, but their tents, their possessions, everything. Right. And then there's this language, they're going to go down alive into the Hades, go down alive into the grave. Okay. That is a weird expression, right? Go down alive into Sheol. Going down alive into the grave obviously doesn't mean you're being buried alive, right? Per se. But going down alive into Hades, or dying alive, that's why it seems so weird, represents is a way of speaking that's talking about a violent death. Right. So from their perspective, a natural death, right? You get old, you reach a certain age, you begin to decline. Right. I'm an old man, so this is getting personal, but right, you start getting aches and pains, you start having less energy, you start feeling more tired more often. This advances as you get older and older. You get tireder and tireder. Eventually, you fall asleep, you don't wake up, you die. Right? That's the natural course, right? Or the visitation that this is talking about would be like a sickness. There's a plague, there's a disease that comes through, but even then it follows that same sort of pattern. You're stricken, you're sick, and so that makes you weak and tired, right? You get more and more tired, maybe you're in pain, but then you fall asleep, you die, and the pain is over, right? Um, Whereas the idea here of going down into Hades alive is you're awake and alert, you're walking through life, you're minding your own business, and boom, you're struck down and you're dead before you even realize it. Right. And that is seen obviously as not as good of a death as a death of old age. We want everyone to die of old age, full of years. I did a funeral a few weeks ago for a 95-year-old, right? And while it's always sad to lose someone, when someone's 95, right, and you're surrounded by like 4 generations of family, and everyone has stories and fond memories of this person. It's a different kind of thing when that person dies than especially when a young person dies suddenly, right? And so this is just reflecting the reality of that. So that's the contrast that Moses is making here, right? They're not going to have that kind of death, right? That happens. It just happens in the natural order of things here in our fallen world. But this is going to be a sudden, violent kind of death they're going to suffer because of what they've done, as a consequence of what they've done. And to make it clear to everyone, right, the seriousness of the sin that they've fallen prey to. Now, as he finished speaking all these words, the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened and swallowed them down with their houses, and all the men with Korah and all their tents. So they and all with them went down alive into Hades, and the earth covered them, and they perished from the midst of the congregation. Then all Israel around them fled at their cry, for they were saying, lest the earth also swallow us down. Fire also came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense. So obviously that would be terrifying, as you imagine. That's why the people are running around scared that they might also be swallowed up by the earth. And this happens in the middle of the camp. Right. And so the fact that this happens in this way, right after Moses says this in the middle of the camp, makes it very clear that this is God's doing. This is not a normal thing. There didn't just happen to be an earthquake that caused a fissure. Right. This was a very selective earth eating, right, of people. Meaning that it's very clearly, right, God's judgment. And then flashbacks. Remember when we talked about Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons? Remember what happened to them? They came and offered strange fire. They offered incense inappropriately before the Lord, and fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. That happens to these others who were offering incense inappropriately, okay, for what they did. And we talked before about how this represents God's holiness. These are people who entered God's holiness in a sinful way for sinful reasons. sort of hardened in their wickedness. So now this has happened. Okay, now this has happened. We're going to read a little bit here of the aftermath. Chapter 17. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest. Take up the copper censers out of the midst of those burned up, and scatter the strange fire there. Notice strange fire. So as to sanctify the censers of those sinners, even the censers of the men who sinned at the cost of their lives, and make them into beaten plates as a covering for the altar, so they might be brought before the Lord and sanctified to become a sign to the children of Israel. Okay. So all the censers are gathered up with the idea that they're going to melt down the metal and make a metallic cover for the altar of incense, the temple, with the idea that that's a reminder, right? That's a reminder. Nadab and Abihu are a reminder to the priests and the high priest about the seriousness of entering into the holy place, right? This is about the seriousness of the people trying to seize the priesthood or seize these certain roles related to God's holiness for themselves. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, took the copper censers, which those burned up had brought, and they added them as a covering for the altar, as a memorial to the children of Israel, that no outsider who is not of Aaron's seed should put incense before the Lord and be like Korah and his insurrection, as the Lord said by the hand of Moses. Okay, so we're actually going to stop there in terms of, I'm not going to stop talking, but we're going to stop there in terms of the text. We'll pick up there because another episode related, but another episode's going to ensue. And I don't think we have enough time to talk about that here. But to say some more about this now that we've read this with Korah, it's worth noting that a large number of the Psalms, and if your holiday season isn't busy enough, or if you're looking for an interesting devotional thing to do during this holiday season, you can do this. A number of the Psalms are attributed to the sons of Korah. That's this Korah. So makes clear that not everyone in his family, we're going to see some Korahites mentioned later too, that this opportunity to sort of distance oneself literally from Korah was taken up by some members of his own family or his own clan, his own extended family as well. And some of them are later going to become psalmists. And what's interesting about at least some of those psalms that are labeled as Psalms of Korah is that a lot of them talk about being saved from Hades or Sheol. A lot of them sort of meditate on this moment. This idea of one's sin, the wickedness one is allowed to take over their life, sort of dragging them down toward Sheol, toward Hades, towards death, and God rescuing them. That's not how we usually read what we just read. How we usually read what we just read, right, is, oh, this is another time where that mean, grumpy Old Testament God smites a whole bunch of people, right? They do something bad and God wipes them out, right? Ground opens up and swallows them, fire burns them up, right? But that's not how it's being read within the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, within the rest of the Old Testament. The focus there is on the mercy that God shows in giving them that chance after chance. But even at the very end, when the time has come where sin is going to result in death, where sin is going to result in destruction, in that very moment, God gives one last chance. Are you sure? Are you sure you don't want to turn away from this now? Right. And so those who took that chance And those who in future generations are alive because their fathers and forefathers, right? They exist because their fathers and forefathers took that opportunity to repent, look back on this and look at it as the mercy of God. Right? The mercy of God. Another angle on this, as we've talked about before, and as we were alluding to early on, God has called different people to different things. Use the example of the Bezalel and the other craftsmen, right? God has called different people to different things in his kingdom, right? In his community to keep everything running. We need lots of people with different gifts that he gives them and different skills and different abilities, fulfilling the roles that God has called them to. But then as now, right, there are certain people who are desirous of certain positions. There are certain people who will find what they've been called to not satisfactory to them for various reasons. Either it doesn't give them enough sort of public approval and reinforcement. Nobody's gets up in front of the church on a Sunday and thanks the person who replaced the roll of toilet tissue after they finished off the last one in the men's bathroom. But that person has done a great service to the people of that congregation. But nobody's going to thank them, right? Nobody's going to thank the person who's, going and working on the plumbing in the sink, changing light bulbs, cleaning things up that are going to get dirty again just as fast and have to be cleaned again, probably by the same person over and over again in the parish. Those people don't have the high profile jobs. They don't get to stand up in front of the church and get credit for it a lot of the time. They don't get robes to wear. They don't have an appreciation Sunday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What that exposes is a certain way of thinking that this passage shows us how sinful it is. Because that way of thinking, of course, just like these rebels with Korah, that way of thinking leaves God out of the picture. Right? Where is God in that picture? Where is the idea that, one day God might say to you, well done, my good and faithful servant, that it's his approval we're looking for, that he's the one we're being faithful to, that we're doing these acts of service to serve God. And even when we're doing them to serve our fellow human beings, we're doing that because serving our fellow human beings is serving God, because our fellow human beings are the image of God. Right? God gets lifted out of the picture and it just becomes, I did this or I do this all the time and no one says thank you and no one appreciates it. That person is always getting credit, right? So there is that element. How destructive that can be. How destructive to your salvation that can be. To fall into looking at even your church life, your church community life, beyond just your life in your family, your life in your workplace, right? Bad enough there. But even your life in the church can end up descending into just you not thinking about God and just thinking about how bitter you are at the other people at church for how they've treated you and how they haven't, done the right things or let you do what you want to do in the church or, right? And then sort of last of all, this is a more specific application of that. One thing we should learn from this chapter and a half is that anyone who pursues ordained office, anything as a deacon or a priest, usually people don't approach becoming a reader or a subdeacon with quite as much grasping. But I suppose one could. But anyone who pursues ordained office needs to realize that if God hasn't called you to it, and you pursue it and chase after it, and God help you actually get it, it will destroy you. If God hasn't called you to be a priest and some bishop makes you a priest, it will destroy you. It will destroy your life. It will destroy your faith. It will destroy everything, and you'll do a lot of damage to a lot of other people in the process, in some poor parish or parishes. Same thing with a deacon. Same thing. And probably subdeacons and readers have caused plenty of havoc in their day too. Right. And so in thinking about, this is a men's Bible study, right? So in thinking about service to God in ordained office, the first and only consideration, and I mean this really only, is God calling me to do this? And if there's some reason that the church says you can't do it, that means God's not calling you to do it. So I'll be blunt. If you're a woman, God's not calling you to do it. If you're divorced, God's not calling you to do it. That doesn't mean there's something bad or evil or wrong with you, right? It just means there's another role God has for you. And it's not the ordained priesthood. Right? If you're interested in wealth and success in life, God's not calling you to it. If there's another, I'll say, if there's another job you could do and be happy and live a happy life and have a family and do that other job, God's not calling you to the priesthood. He might be calling you to be a deacon and do that other job, but he's not calling you to be a priest. No matter what you feel or think you feel, he's not. Right? The flip side of that is the only concern. So if it becomes clear to you that God is calling you to be a priest, and you're like me and you can't carry a tune in a bucket, like you can't sing to save your life, don't worry about it. God's calling you to be a priest. Okay? If it's clear to you that God's calling you to be a priest, and the idea of standing in front of a congregation and trying to talk for 30 seconds, let alone 10 minutes, is terrifying to you because you have a phobia of public speaking, right? Remember Moses. Don't worry about it. God's calling you to be a priest. Right. That's the only concern, right? And if God isn't calling you to be a priest, again, he has another role for you. He has something else for you to do. And it is better for you to do that than to try to be a priest. Infinitely better for you to do that than to try and be a priest. Okay? And being a priest is not easy, by the way. Remember what St. Paul said, not many of you should presume to be teachers. Because a teacher will face a stricter judgment. And this is very clear in the Orthodox Church. Right? I not only, on the day of judgment, when I stand before Christ, not only do I have to answer for myself and my own sins, and for everything I've done and not done and everything I've said and not said, I have to answer for every parishioner I've ever had. And we should all be praying for Bishop Nicholas all the time. Because on the day of judgment, he's going to have to stand before Christ and answer for his own sins and everything he said and didn't say and everything he did and didn't do. And he's going to have to answer for every one of his clergy and every one of the parishioners in his parishes. That's the onus, that's the responsibility that comes with being ordained. And this is one of the reasons why, if you're not called to it, it will crush you. Right? So if you are a young man who thinks God might be calling you to the priesthood, the way you pursue that is asking God to make it clear to you, to make it abundantly clear to you. And take into account the reality of the responsibility and everything that means. Right? And if for any number of reasons you conclude that God is not calling you to that, then salvation is just as available to you or more than it is to priests and bishops, right? By fulfilling what it is that God has called you to, as a person. And of course, there's the old saw that I think this comes from St. John Chrysostom. You know, people in English always say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. St. John Chrysostom said the road to hell is paved with the skulls of sinful priests. So there's that I remember from time to time. So that's a heavy note, but we were reading some heavy stuff tonight. So if anybody has any questions, I'll answer them. If they have any lighter questions, like they want to ask me about, I don't know, series finale of What We Do in the Shadows or something, we could do that too, to lighten the mood. But
I had a question, Father.
yes, sir.
In your case, how clear was it to you at the time you were making this decision that it was your calling?
Yeah. So the reason it was clear to me is I had been briefly a Protestant pastor before I came into the Orthodox Church. And so when I came into the Orthodox Church, I had to go find another job. Right? And the first job was working as a Subway sandwich artist. But then I got a job where I could actually support myself. That's and better things. And I actually had no intention of seeking ordination at that time. I went and got another job. I was doing other things. And I thought, well, I have this theological training. I have these graduate degrees and stuff. Maybe I'll be a deacon at some point. But I was fully intending just to work and be a normal parishioner, right? And I was, it was 7 years before I was, from when I joined the Orthodox Church, like 8 years from when I made the decision that I was made a priest again. And so the reason I ended up becoming a priest is that Bishop Basil found out who I was and my background and stuff, and came and told me he wanted to send me to seminary. So it didn't come from me. Right? It came from someone else whose spiritual judgment I trusted more than my own. Right. And he didn't ask me, really. He sort of said, here's what I want to do. Right. And it was sort of a question of, I mean, he didn't force me. I could have said, no, I refuse. Right. But I took that as a massive sign to me, you know, when a bishop who's a much holier person than I am tells me, I want to send you to seminary and make you a priest. I sort of took that as, okay, that's fully legitimate. So that was how I was sure. And even when I then went to seminary, so I already had a degree, and Bishop Basil said to me, look, you've already got a bunch of graduate degrees. You don't need another degree. He said, so I'm going to send you to St. Tikhon's. And he said, I'm going to send you there just for like a year. He said, I don't care what classes you take. I want you to be in the church services at the monastery, right? The daily cycle of services. And so just immerse yourself in it, right? And so I went, and then they looked over my stuff and they said, yeah, you probably only need to be here 1 year. So I pushed and stayed for 2 years. Like I put it off, like getting out of seminary. And so when I showed up for the second year, apparently the registrar didn't know I was coming back. So figure out what to do with me. And then when I was made a deacon and then a priest, it was the priest at the parish I was assigned to while I was at the seminary on the weekend literally handed me the paperwork. and said, here's the application. I want you to apply to become a deacon. And so it was just me saying, yes, sir. Like, like at each step along the way. So to me, that's what really confirmed it to me, is that there was no point where it was like I was pushing for it at all. It was just me saying yes when someone sort of in spiritual authority over me told me what they thought would be right.
How did that calling compare to your initial calling to join the Orthodox Church? I'm sorry, I'm asking
Yeah.
too personal.
No, it's I hadn't attended that many liturgies when I realized I came to the conclusion that the Orthodox Church was the church. I came to the conclusion this is Christ's church, and therefore I need to be a member of it. I'm sorry?
How old were you then? I mean, at a young age, or?
Oh, no, I was 26. I was 26 and had been a Protestant pastor for a couple of years and got invited to a liturgy one Sunday morning and said, oh, I don't know anything about the Orthodox Church. So I went to it. And then I started coming back, and it wasn't that long before I decided this is Christ's church. If I'm going to be serious about being a Christian, I need to join it, which meant I didn't have a job, which set the other in motion. Yeah, so that's
so at 26, of course, you already had all your degrees by then, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I had an MDiv. I had yeah.
That must be, and on the strength of one visit, it was so powerful that you knew that it was it.
Pretty close. I visited a few more times. I was sort of waiting for the other shoe to fall. I was like, okay, there's gonna be something weird. There's gonna be there's gonna be something they don't tell you when you walk in the door, that you find out about later. But after I mean, it was maybe a couple of months that didn't happen. That I said, yeah, this is it.
Well, thank you for that testimony.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
I've got a question, Father, if you're willing to take another one.
Yes, sir.
This is unrelated, but it's been something that I wanted to ask you for a long time.
Okay.
So I've got some family members who have more or less been traumatized by some penal substitutionary views of hell.
Yeah.
I'm using traumatized pretty seriously.
Literally, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
11 years old and you told you're going to hell, it's not
right
the best way to handle that. How do you, and for example, this family member is very concerned with her boyfriend, who's not a Christian, but he's a decent guy, and she's just totally obsessing with the idea that he's going to go to hell because he's not saved. What do you say to someone who's thinking along those lines?
Right, and so I'm trying to approach this in a sort of pastoral way, right? The logical
This
argument
is
pretty clear.
Question. Yeah,
right?
It's a very pastoral question.
Yeah, the logical argument, right, is there, but that's not the big, right? The big issue. What I usually talk about with people in that kind of situation, and the closest thing to that, I regularly encounter this, which is somebody's wanting to join the Orthodox Church and their spouse / girlfriend / fiance / boyfriend / whatever, right, isn't, and is from some other kind of Christian background where they think, oh, you're joining the Orthodox Church, now you're one of those weird Catholics who's going to hell, right? So, which is a similar kind of thing. And so the key thing, I think, is that rather than approaching things from the perspective of worry, right? We approach things from the perspective of, okay, well, if the issue is that this person hasn't embraced Jesus Christ, right? And let alone, everything else involved with salvation. But that's the first issue, is that, right, we want this person to become a Christian. We'll leave it at that, right, in terms of what that entails. What can she do to help that happen? Preaching at him every time she sees him is not gonna do that. In fact, it's probably gonna do the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. But what tends to work is encouraging that person to say, okay, this means you need to take your faith really seriously, right? Because his window into what a Christian is and whether that makes any difference, right? And whether that's a good thing and whether that's something he should want for himself is going to be based on what he sees in her. Because she's now the person closest to him who is a Christian.
Right.
Right. And so if he looks at her life and doesn't think it makes that much of a difference, right, or thinks it's somehow a negative in her life, like if he thinks, oh, this is giving her anxiety and driving her crazy, right,
yeah,
then that's not going to make him want to become one. And we underestimate how much of, so, I gave a little bit of testimony of me. My wife was raised without religion, completely, like zero, right? Her mom told her when she went to school, that if anybody asked her what religion she was, she should say Methodist, because everybody had heard of Methodists, but nobody knew what they believed really. So they just leave her alone after that. But so, right. But she had zero religion. So when she met me, her view of Christianity was based on stuff she had seen in the mainstream media. So you could imagine what that was like, right? Well, now she knows someone who's right, a Christian. And so now is the opportunity for her to change that view. And when we were first just talking, like in a friendly way, right? She found out I was Orthodox. She's like, I've never heard of that. Da, da, da. She ended up going to the local Greek Orthodox Church without even saying anything to me. And she was blown away by it. She went there and was like, what is this? This isn't, I thought Christians were just angry Republicans. Like that's what the media told me, right? Like that's and so her whole view of what Christianity is and who Christ is and all of this was transformed and built from scratch, right, by that. And so that dating relationship could be an opportunity for him to find out what Christianity is all about. That means she has to be really serious about living out what Christianity is all about. But that gives her something positive to do and to think about and pray about and work on, rather than just sit and worry.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, let me see. I think I got a couple things in the chat here, but I need my cheaters. So with Strange Fire, we don't have any more detail. That's just the same. It's the same phrase that is used in the story of Nadab and Abihu, and we talked about it at the time. We know that part of the problem with Nadab and Abihu was that they were drunk when they did it, but that it's also implied that they did it at the wrong time or maybe with the wrong type of incense. But it's not sort of spelled out exactly. So Strange Fire, when it's used to refer to incense in these passages, generally just refers to an incense offering that's not accepted by God, but that could be for a variety of reasons. And even in one case where it's not acceptable to God, there could be multiple reasons, right? Like them showing up drunk at the wrong time, right? Et cetera, all go into it not being acceptable. And so that phrase then kind of becomes emblematic of something that's directed toward God as worship, but for various reasons is inappropriate and not acceptable to him. That's in the number 250. I wouldn't read too much into 250 here because that number changes around a lot when you look at different Greek versions and the Hebrew. So that means it's the translators and stuff didn't treat it as precise. They didn't see some specific symbolic significance that they were trying to preserve. And yes, that is a lot of sensors. Enough that if you melted them all down, you could make covers to go all the way around, right? All the way around the altar. Yeah. So, I've met people who were raised Orthodox in other countries who had bad childhood experiences that way, especially in Eastern Europe, especially those who came up during the end of the communist period. And that sort of burned them, right? And that is tough to overcome. In many cases, there was a lot of corruption. Some of that corruption was deliberate, as in, state agencies, communist state agencies infiltrating churches, right? And deliberately doing damage. And agents of the government even getting ordained to different offices and things. So there's a lot of legitimate there. And in the period right after the collapse of communism, there was a lot of financial corruption because the kind of capitalism that immediately came into Russia and a lot of former Soviet bloc countries was not sort of free market entrepreneurship. It was capitalism like black markets and the mob and that kind of thing. And so even people who were legitimately and faithfully involved with church things in those countries, when the mob runs your city, if you want to keep the church open and functioning, you got to kind of work with the mob insofar as you can morally justify it, right? In the same way that they had to try to work underneath the communist government for 75 years, who were basically a bunch of gangsters. So that's not a, sort of apology for the corruption. It's just that it was real and there were circumstances where that happened. And so people who grew up in that and came to the US tend to generalize their experience. But this happens with all kinds of groups. I mean, I know lots of people. One of the reasons my wife grew up without any religion in her life at all is that her uncle, her father's brother, was a Baptist minister who literally ran off with and stole the building fund from the church he was at. So her dad, his brother, decided, okay, religion's a racket. This is just all a bunch of crooks. Because his brother was a crook. Right? And so this happens all over the place where people generalize from, right, their own experience. And the only way to overcome that, I don't think looking at traditions other than the Orthodox tradition will help with that, because any tradition you pick, there's going to be scandals right around the corner. Right? I mean, you look at Roman Catholicism, scandals. You look at Protestant mega churches now, scandals. You look at, right? Everybody has, because all churches are populated with sinners, right? But the only way to counteract those kind of bad and even traumatic experiences is dealing with the trauma and having good experiences, having positive experiences. And if she's so burned that she doesn't want to go near an Orthodox church, those experiences may have to be with like people from the church, but outside of a church setting. Right? Places where she can volunteer for something or just be around people from the church. And if she sees that the people from your particular parish, right, they love each other, they support each other, they're doing these positive things, right? Sort of the first step to overcoming that might be like, well, I think the church in general isn't great, but this is a good, right? This one here, this local one here, well, this is a good one, right? This one's different, right? But that's something you can't tell someone that. They have to see that, right? They have to see that in action again. So it's an extension of the other answer I gave. People believe what they see for themselves. I mean, St. Thomas, people believe what they see for themselves. They believe what they experience for themselves. And the best way for us to encourage people to become Orthodox Christians is to show them with our actions and in our lives what it is and what it's all about. So that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back next month, third week of January. I don't know what that date is, third Thursday of January, but I can't think of anything on the third Thursday of January that would conflict. So we'll just assume that that's going to work for now. And we'll see everybody then.